Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are very excited. We are actually flipping our shit in the common parlance because we have a guest on, and it's Bruce McKenna. He's a TV and film writer, and he's also the co-executive producer, creator, and principal writer on The Pacific, which came out in 2010.
And he also wrote some of your favorite episodes of Brother Brother.
And if you're a listener of our podcast, you know that we are obsessed with the Pacific, and you can go listen to our episodes on that. So welcome, Bruce. Thanks so much for coming on our podcast.
Glad to be here.
All right, so let's jump right in. Before you worked in film and TV, you worked as a journalist and you studied Russian intellectual history for a year. So why the shift, and how do your experiences as a journalist and your studies influence your writing for film and TV?
Yeah, no, I was a history major in college and then I went to grad school and it had a deep impact on me as a writer. Most of the stuff I do is historically based. I know how to research, and so that has always helped my writing, even in on fictional stories that are not adaptations of things that really happened. That had a huge impact on particularly on Band in the Pacific. But underneath that, intellectual history is the study of the transmission of culture. One of the things it looks at, and ideas and identity. And film is it's a really interesting way that these things happen. I mean, it's the most powerful medium really in the world, film and television now. And so I was drawn to it because it's about ideas. And people make the mistake that think, oh, what happens on television? It's never about what happens, the plot. It's always about theme. And theme is very closely related to intellectual history of sort of the grist of what's underneath of the daily events and what's really going on. And so, I always loved movies, and when I got sick of grad school, I decided at some point to start trying to write scripts because I was really drawn to it. My girlfriend at the time, now my wife for 34 years, 30 something, I can't remember. She's an actress. So I had a sort of an interest in drama and plays. She was a stage actress. It all came together and it fit my emotional and intellectual needs. So, and then I had to make money because we had a kid. So I decided to be a professional screenwriter. So I don't know how that worked out, but anyway, that's sort of the shorthand answer.
Yeah, I also have a history degree, and I took a class in my fourth year called Canadian Intellectual Traditions, and everyone I tell that to is like, that sounds tedious. I'm like, no, 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 it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, and look, it's all about narrative. Everything is narrative. Religion is narrative. History is narrative, and obviously, entertainment is narrative. And entertainment is misconstrued as sort of trivial. And actually, entertainment is the oldest cultural construct that we have, other than family, I guess. And so, I realize that you have a enormous pulpit in television, in particular, to change people's minds about things or instruct them, and that's what narrative's purpose is to put a moral grid out there that to teach us how and how not to behave. So, that's informs my work. It informs what I want to work on. I'm always thinking about what am I trying to say about not about the past, but about the present and what is important to us now. And all narratives are about the present, whether they're historical or not. They're always influenced by what's going on in the life of the writer and the cultural milieu around the.
Yeah, no, for sure. What drew you to World War II in particular?
My wife says I was a draft dodger in several previous lives. I don't know. I mean, I was always drawn. I was that kid, loved to play army and whatnot. What drew me to the war was not what draws most sort of geeky guys. I don't know anything about weapons. I don't know much about, you know, airplanes, or what drew me was the moral cost, the sacrifice that attracted me. And at a very early age. I mean, one of the first chapter books I ever read was a book on aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and had big pictures in it. And, so it's just been something in me for a long time. But I've always been fascinated by the moral stakes of war, what it does to people and how it affects us. And I don't know why. I just don't. But, from a very early age, when I was in high school, my high school AP history project was to interview veterans, including a German paratrooper who fought against Easy Company at Normandy, which was pretty interesting. I didn't know that at the time, but, so and the questions that I asked then, again, were it's not about what they did, it's what they felt. What went through their hearts? How did they survive? And that's always kind of informed my writing about it to get underneath the facts, as it were, to get what it's really like. So,
That's our area of interest too, for sure. When I tell people I'm into World War II and they wanna talk about, tanks and whatever, I'm
yeah.
like, "Yeah, I mean, I get
Talk
it,"
to
but
me. I have no
also
idea.
yeah, I mean, one of our earliest episodes we did, we talked about myth making in World War II and the concept of, like, looking for the good war kind of thing, and to us, the stories we tell ourselves about war are just equally as interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I don't call it the good war. I don't think it was the good war. It was the necessary war. No war is good, but it was necessary. And, so my attitude about World War II is I shy away from the greatest generation. And, they did what was necessary. And, and when you view it through that lens, you begin to see the cost of it. It's not the easy flag waving thing that it is for a lot of people. It was really, really difficult and damaging to the people who participated in it. So my writing on the war and those 2 series in particular tried to focus on.
You've written World War II scripts over several decades. Obviously, Band came out or, was written in the late '90s, and then The Pacific came out maybe like 10 a little more than 10 years later. And our listeners might have heard us say that shows like Band of Brothers and The Pacific are testaments to the times in which they were made. To me, The Pacific is very obviously like a post 9/11 show. It would have been different if it had come out before. So, has your decision making process changed over time about what's important to convey with your writing?
Yeah, I mean, look, yes, unfortunately, World War II in particular, World War II is the largest social event in human history. I mean, it is the biggest thing that's ever happened on planet Earth. And so you could do Band of Brothers 10 times as a 10-hour limited series or the Pacific, and it would never be the same twice with all different characters and different themes. And, so you have to pick your theme and look at what you want to write about. Band came out after Saving Private Ryan. The book Band of Brothers was used by the producers of Saving Private Ryan to sort of inform their world that they were working from to make the script and the movie. And then one of Tom Hanks' executives, Kirk Sadowski, recognized this would be a great limited series. So when we started working on it, it was a little bit more nostalgic about what sacrifices that generation made. What did Grandpa do during the war, and to do it a little bit more accurate. But there is a bit of a filter on what we were doing because we started working on it in a non-war environment. The Vietnam War had been over, Gulf War One had been done. It was just a different time. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. It happened 2 days after the premiere, and band became extremely important culturally for this country, for people to understand what young men go through when they go to war. And so part of band's success, I mean, it's a great show, but part of its cultural importance is because it came out during 9/11 and that right after 9, it was made right before 9/11. It's not ironic. There's no irony in Band of Brothers. And, most modern television, we live in the age of irony now. So most modern television, whether it's Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, these are ironic shows. Band is not ironic. The Pacific, it's in the title. It's ironic. It's right there in the title. I began working on the Pacific in 2003, right when the Gulf War began to, was really at its height. And so it definitely informed how I crafted that series, what decisions I made, what themes I wanted to explore. And it is probably the most expensive anti-war film ever made. I mean, it's the necessary war, not the good war. It's brutal, it's honest, it's toxic, it's difficult to watch. It's not as popular as Band because it shows combat in a much more accurate way than Band did. There's no filter on it. There's no nostalgia in the Pacific the way there is a little bit in Band. And so it had a very different purpose. And from the very beginning, and occasionally we had to fight hard to keep that vision as we were working on it. And there are times when I questioned why I was doing it. I was very uncomfortable with the Gulf War by the time we began shooting the Pacific because it took 4 years to get it into production. It was definitely a series that spoke to what we were going through. And the other World War II things that I've worked on are also similarly influenced by things that I wanted to say about American culture in particular today. I'm working on a show for MGM television about a submarine in World War II. And submarines are really interesting because they were the most democratic of all the services, and they had to be, including racially democratic. Most submarines either had Filipino or Black stewards on them, what their experience was like, and how the men accepted them or didn't accept them. That's a very contemporary themed story. So whenever you're doing any, I have this pithy saying in Hollywood, there is no such thing as historical drama. There's either good drama or bad drama, and all good drama is about us now. Otherwise, nobody watches it. So that's a long-winded answer, but I hope that I answered your question.
No, it's great. I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time. There are fewer and fewer voices that can speak to the events of World War II. How does that change your approach to writing World War II scripts and screenplays?
It makes it easier. You can make stuff up. No, it does make it challenging. I mean, I just finished a feature that I wrote for Fred Smith. He just passed away, who founded Federal Express, and it's based on a book coming out about the raid on Ploesti in World War II, the on the oil fields. And there's nobody alive anymore that can speak to this. And so, you have to dig into the historical record a little bit more carefully. You have to try and be more creative about finding documents. The book focuses on the American POWs who were held and then helped by particularly two Romanian noble people, a prince and a princess who were related, who helped them and protected them and then got them out of the country in the largest extraction of prisoners in World War II. It's on the face of it, are really interesting, but then I discovered that the princess in particular had ties to US intelligence during the war. And that opened up a whole avenue for me of like, okay, so because of a misspent youth, let's put it that way, I kind of know a lot about the OSS and the early tentacles of intelligence in Eastern Europe in World War II. So I looked into what I know from there, and I know how to look into sources and discovered that the princess's daughter had an affair with the head of the OSS in Bucharest. So, so it opened up this thing like, oh my God, she was a spy, in some ways. And so the script changed. And what happened to her, of course, is that she lost everything. The Soviets came in and took all of her land, took all of her, and she died destitute essentially at the age of 100. So that opened up a totally different story for me, like a woman and her cousin who gave everything in the service of freeing these Americans and helping the Americans, even though it meant they would lose everything. And the stakes on them were much higher than people realized because they were actually could have been killed by the Nazis. So, you just do a lot of research and you dig in, you dig in, you dig in, you dig in. And if you don't have the actual people, you try and find documents. You go through after action reports. You just get creative, and then at some point you got to make stuff up. So, which begs your next question. I'm sure.
We, obviously love the books that The Pacific is based on, A Helmet for My Pillow and With the Old Breed, and I think that those books are very much you get such a strong sense of the men who wrote them. The newer shows like The Masters of the Air and stuff, I think you can tell that the guys aren't around anymore. There's, like you kinda get that sense from it, there's just, like, a little bit of, I don't know if I'd call it authenticity missing maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, there's no dirt under the fingernails. You know,
Yeah.
And I get that, and I think you're right. I was very lucky on Band. We'll talk about Band first a little bit and then the Pacific. On Band, I got to interview all of the guys that were still alive in 1999. I went to a reunion in Denver and spent 4 days drinking with them all, and I have hundreds of hours of tapes with them, so I knew them. And, that really helped the show. And the other writers did the same. And it just helped us get a little bit of the dirt under the fingernails. On the other hand, it also constrained us from telling some more accurate stories about those men, and I'll give you a couple of examples because everybody's dead. Just things that the men did that were not as heroic as perhaps the 21st century audience would like to see them. The fact that one of the guys in Easy Company shot Spears in the ass in Holland. Okay. That's not in the show. I was told that by, a couple guys. The shenanigans that they went through late in the war. One of the guys, who's my favorite character, not featured very much in the show, began to summarily execute SS officers whenever they found them. And this is not uncommon. And then he would cut their death heads rings off and put them in a chain around his neck, which is a very common, and that's not in the show. Things that are a little darker and we sort of had an agreement with someone, but and we did it on the Pacific because both Sledge and Lecky, particularly Lecky, were dead. We had a little bit more leeway to be a little bit more accurate. In Lecky's case, his widow, Vera, directly gave me permission to do whatever I wanted to do. She said, look, you tell the truth about my husband. He was a pain in the ass. I loved him dearly, but, you can do what you need to do. And I talked to her throughout, and her daughter, Joan, in particular. They were so helpful to me to get a sense of what the man was really like, not just from his writings, but just what he was like after the war and he never wore khaki again for the rest of his life. He would dress for dinner. He always had candlelight. The war profoundly destroyed him. And of course, what you realize is that trauma gets passed down generationally to the children and even the grandchildren. And if you believe in blood memory, it's passed down in your genes even. You can get a deep understanding of these people from talking to their family members. So I do that as much as possible. It's very helpful. And with the Sledge family, I talked to his widow, who we met after the war, but she gave me access to some of his writings that were not published. Interviewed his son, one of his sons, in depth, which was very helpful. Both sons were very helpful. So you just do what you can. But so there's a plus and a minus to them being dead, because sometimes you're freed up to do some things. If Herbert Sobel had not been dead in Band of Brothers, we wouldn't have written him the way we did. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. I'll pass you off to Mart to, actually, this is a good segue into the Band of Brothers section here.
Yes, can you tell us how you got involved in band in the first place?
I begged. I begged and begged and begged. And it was early in my career. I'd sold a couple of things, both of which were World War II related, ironically. One was a script about code talkers that I got paid $900, an option on, a spec script that I wrote. And then the other was a script about the radar program in England during the Battle of Britain, that I wrote for working title. So I had that two things that and I was struggling, to be honest. And I heard that they were gonna do Band of Brothers, and I got my manager at the time. I didn't even have an agent, I don't think. But I had my manager call Playtone, Tom Hanks's company, and say, or no, he called an executive at HBO and said, "I have this client. He loves World War II. He's a fanatic. He's written these 2 scripts. You gotta get him in there." And she did. She called Playtone, and I went and had a meeting with the lowest executive on the rung, and then he got a meeting for me with somebody a little bit above him. And then I went in, I think, 6 times, and they gave me the Bible to band, which was a huge 180-page episode by episode breakdown of what happened. And I pitched, the first episode of Holland. I pitched, the second episode of Bastogne. I pitched D-Day. And then I've subsequently found out that they had already assigned most of these scripts to other writers. I was the last writer hired, and I got the episode nobody else wanted to write, which was the first episode of Bastogne, where nothing happens. There's no big battle. They just freeze. A couple guys get wounded, and they're cold. Nobody wanted that episode. So I got hired, and I went away and I looked at the Bible, and then I threw the Bible out. I never looked at it again. I had an inkling and of an idea. I said, "Well, look, I'm intrigued by the medic, because nobody ever writes about medics and what they go through, and they actually perfectly distill everything that all the men go through, which is that it's a very sacrificial lamb position. You cannot fight back, and what kept on going through my head is, who does God confess to? What happens to all that psychic energy that a one man absorbs of pain and suffering? And what does he do? And so I went to the producers and said, "Look, I got this idea. We would focus on the medic." And at first they said no, because he's not one of our main guys and he's peripheral. And I said, "Yeah, but you don't understand. He touches every one of those guys in this show. We have a way of reconnecting with all our characters after the episode 5 to get us ready for episode 7, where some of them die. And so why don't we use the medic to touch base with everybody?" And that's what the episode is in a lot of ways, is literally touching base. And then I went to the reunion with the men. I talked to them all about the medic. They all said the same thing about Eugene Rowe. He was an angel. He was an angel. He was an angel. He was an angel. I'm like, okay, he was literally an angel. And the episode was originally titled Angels from Above, because that's what particularly the Dutch called the paratroopers, in their white wings coming down. And then it just evolved from there. He's from Louisiana. I did a lot of research into who he was. I talked to his grandson, talked to other medics. I talked to a lot of surgeons who had been at Bastogne. The other medic in the company, Ralph Spina, talked to me a lot about him, with the experiences of what research being a medic. the theme of suffering, I mean, it's a very unconscious and conscious religious episode. It has a lot of religious imagery in it. It's about sacrifice. It's about healing, the healing touch of human touch, and there's touching throughout the episode. So that's how I got episode 6 in particular and dove into it. And you sent me your list of questions about what do I do? How much can I get away with? And I remember when I was doing the episode, people's like, "Well, you made this nurse up." I'm like, "No, I didn't make the nurse up. Renee Lemaire is real. The black Congolese nurse is real. Those are real people." And I looked into them as much as I could. Renee was married. She was 18 years old. What her life was like. I did a lot of research into her as much as you could in 2000. So that's how I got the episode. And it turned out pretty well for me. The episode that nobody wanted to write.
It's wild, absolutely wild to me to hear that because I think that a lot of people would say that Bastogne is maybe the best episode of Band of Brothers. I mean, we feel that way for sure, but there's certainly a lot of people with whom Ro really resonates, as a character. Like people come away from the series still thinking about him and the fact that, yes, like the other men did perceive him as an angel or whatever, but crucially, he didn't want it really. When he joined the military, in his mind, he didn't think that they were gonna take his gun away and make him a medic. So, yeah, it's just wild to me to hear that, you know
You can't shoot back when you're a medic.
Mhm.
And so he's sort of a metaphor for the rest of us in war. He's a metaphor for the audience. I mean, not a metaphor, he's an avatar for the audience. He experiences what the audience experiences. Oh my God, I can't shoot back. I feel terrible for these men. The pathos and the pity of war is crushed into him and he can't do anything with it. It's probably the best thing I've ever written, and I'm very, very proud of it. And it was well directed. My shout out to David Leland, who's passed away, did a phenomenal job directing it. He did some things I disagreed with, but he added some things I thought were brilliant. The one scene that he added that was not in the script was the scene where the man bleeds out and the two nurses together try and save him. And the blood on, it's a religious, I mean, it's the blood of Christ right there. And it's really, really well done. So my hat's off to him. And then having Eugene use Renee's handkerchief as a bandage was also the director's idea on the day, which was, it's unconsciously, I was moving in that direction and he just recognized it but it made it even more of a poignant moment. So, cause I had that kerchief throughout the show, but yeah, it's pretty good. I'll take it.
Yeah, it's pretty good. We like it.
I like it.
So it's been, I don't know, it's been 25 years since it came out. Would you do anything different today to this show, you think?
That's a good question. What I tell people, I'm always asked by people, well, which show is better? Or which I prefer this one over that one. And the only answer I have to that is I'm answering your question is if Band of Brothers had been made after the Pacific, it would be far darker. Those men suffered far more than what we portrayed in the show, particularly after the war. And it's interesting when the show came out, I was contacted by a playwright and he'd done a lot of things in his life, interior decorating and playwriting, and he'd been a medic in Europe. And he loved the show, and he said, "I can't believe, you captured." And so we became friends, and we had lunch a few times. He lived on the West Coast when I did, and he just said, "You got a lot of it right, but it was a lot worse than what you depicted. It was just terrible and painful, and the destruction and the darkness and the violence and the nihilism. It was worse in the Pacific, of course, but it would have been a darker show. We would have shown somebody shooting spears in the ass. We would have shown, we blinked a little bit on the killing of the German prisoners by spears. That absolutely happened. We all know that, and, it was the guys, and especially after the war. I always had an issue with the end of Band of Brothers where they play baseball as if their innocence could be recaptured. And their innocence was never recaptured. Those men were destroyed by what they went through. And what people don't realize about the paratroopers in World War II, they were the Navy SEALs or the Delta Force of the American military in World War II. They were allowed to operate without a lot of rules. And they did. They hunted down SS officers and murdered them. That's not an easy thing to bear as a human being. Yeah, we hated them. We hated those Nazis, and I don't rue the fact that they were killed. They deserved it, to be honest. But to do it is another matter. So it would have been a darker show. than it was. Would it have been better? I don't know. I mean, it's not what audiences wanted to see in 2001. They wanted to see heroism. They wanted to see the sacrifice and the struggle and the bonding and the love between the men and everything, all the stuff that is so great in band. They didn't want to see the cost. And I know what the cost is in some of those men. They did some of them practically drank themselves to death. They, struggle with PTSD in ways that are terrible. So I think the show would have been darker for sure.
Yeah, there's really something about when it came out for many of us, it's like our fathers and grandfathers sort of thing. So it's very much just the prism through which we wanted to see them, and maybe not necessarily look at those things. You know, they all came back from World War II with, we say this all the time, a head full of trauma soup and literally no resources or anything. You just go home and you try not to unload it on your family, you know?
And most of them did. So it's tragic. It really is. And that particular, I don't know what it's as much of what it's like in Canada, but the United States treats its veterans like shit. They just don't. There's no help for them. There's no. They just expect them to move on with their lives. It was a different time after World War II. It was, people wanted to move on with their lives. And it was also the end of the Depression, we just wanted to move forward. But those guys really suffered. One of the things I like to say, which doesn't make me popular with the flag waving set, but, I believe strongly that the United States had to win the war. They did whatever they had to do to win that war. Thank God. And then we lost our soul because of what we did in that war. And, the men coming back, particularly the young officer corps of World War II, the second lieutenants and captains, what they witnessed and experienced was might makes right in a very visceral way. And then they came back, and you look at American foreign policy from 1950 to 2000, 2010, in the successive administration eyes, might makes right. McNamara and John F. Kennedy and a slew of Curtis LeMays who had to win that war. And what was it like for young guys that were, that's in the Pacific. It's not in band. It's what you've witnessed, what you've done. How do you deal with it? What's your responsibility morally to what you've seen and done? And Eugene Sledge's decision to go into, basically science and botany and, look at flowers and, it's like Lecky's decision to bear witness. We didn't do that in band. We never see them after the war. I know those guys. I know their families. The trauma was profound.
For sure.
I think that's a good point to hand you back over to Sam and talk a little bit more extensively about the Pacific.
Sure. Come on, let's go. I'm ready.
So after Band of Brothers, Tom Hanks asked you not only to write, but also to create The Pacific. So what was that phone call like?
Well, I'll back up a little bit because it's not. There's an added element to that. The Pacific was born on the day of the Emmys for band, and there was a super duper HBO party with Wolfgang Puck. This is back in the days when HBO had a lot of money. The Band of Brothers party was inside the HBO Emmys party. That you had to have a special super ticket to get into the band party. And Wolfgang Puck cooked for us, and it was just but it was a bittersweet night because band won for best miniseries, but the writers lost, which most people don't realize. We did not win the Emmy for the writing on band. And so I went up to Steven Spielberg and his wife, Kate, were sitting at a table that was reserved only for them. So there was a super secret table inside the super secret party, inside the super secret HBO party. And I went up to Steven and Kate looked at me and she says, you were robbed. You guys got robbed. And I said, well, I appreciate that. And I said to Steven, thank you for giving me the opportunity. He originally, Steven Spielberg was supposed to direct episode 6 of Band of Brothers. And that was the phone call that I remember where I got called by Tony Toe, the producer, and said, you just won the lottery. Steven Spielberg is going to direct your episode of Band of Brothers. But he developed some health issues and he couldn't do it. So I went up to him at the Emmy party and I said, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I said, if you ever want to do the Pacific, whatever it is, I'll write you a couple of episodes. And he looked at me and says, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. And that was it. And then 18 months later, my phone rang. It was Gary Getzman, Tom Hanks's producing partner, said, hey, Tom and Steven want to sit down with you and talk to you about doing a show about the Pacific. So I played it cool. Oh, okay. Let me see what my schedule, no, whatever it is. I went into Steven's office at Amblin on the Universal lot, sat down with him and Tom and Gary Getzman, and we just brainstormed in this meeting. We want to do this story about the Pacific. What are the ground rules? We talked about all fictional. We talked about having Japanese characters who go to internment camps. We talked about, whatever it is. And the only thing that I remember that's what Steven said to me in that meeting, I want it to be accurate. I want it to be accurate. And he had begun thinking about the Pacific because he'd hired Hugh Ambrose, Stephen Ambrose's son, to begin collating interviews with veterans from the Pacific to see what came out of it. So actually, the first person hired on the Pacific was Hugh Ambrose, not me. So I called Hugh, and Hugh and I came out of the meeting and said, "Look, give me 6 months. I'll work with Hugh. I'll figure out a way to do this because it's so vast. How do you tell the whole story the way that we did in band?" And none of us had any idea. So I talked to Hugh, and Hugh and I became very close over the course of the Pacific. He passed away, unfortunately, and he had a database of guys, and they were all in the Marine Corps at first. So I began reading, just massive amounts of books. My wife called it the stack of death by my bedside in our house in L.A. All these books about the Pacific, and not the military history, but the moral history of the Pacific. So I started reading that and reading and reading and looking into it, and realized very quickly that the only outfit that goes from the beginning of the war to the end of the war is the 1st Marine Division. So I said, okay, it's gonna be Marine Corps based. That I knew. So then I started looking at these interviews and narrowing it down, and then we began to arrange to interview some of these people on camera. We have probably 50 taped interviews with veterans from the Pacific that didn't make it into sort of the same kind of documentary that we did with band. And so we started arranging for that. And then, so I realized that there were 2 guys that had written these 2 books. One was with the old breed, and the other was that were essentially, between the 2 of them, they could take me through the war. Lecky comes in at Guadalcanal. He exits on Peleliu. Eugene Sledge comes in on Peleliu, exits on Okinawa. And I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I'm like, well, what about, Iwo Jima? And well, I've got this character, John Bastogne, who's in the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. So I'm like, okay, he's in the 1st Marine Divisions, and they're all, Sledge is in the 5th, but he connects guys from the 1st end up in the, so I had this connective tissue. And then I realized when I started doing the research and interviewing people, I'm like, well, I got to interview somebody that fought with Sledge. So I got in touch with this guy, Sid Phillips, and put him on camera. And I discovered that Sid Phillips is in Lecky's company. And in that moment, I knew I had a series because I had connective tissue that was real. I didn't have to make it up, and they would connect, and they did connect. And so that's when I knew. And in addition to that, the 3 episodes that are the secret of the Pacific that nobody knows about were based on aviators. And so I had aviators. We had 3 extra episodes that focused on 2 different aviators. One, Robert Elder, who was a Dauntless pilot off the Yorktown and Enterprise, who fought at the Battle of Midway and then flew into Guadalcanal right after the Battle of the Tenerife. He went to the battlefield and met Marines who were there. He could have met both Bastogne and Lecky. No, not Bastogne, but Lecky could have met there. So, and he flew in the Cactus Air Force for like, two weeks or so because he'd been off the Enterprise. And then he flew off and he trained pilots. And the second pilot was based on the book Flyboys, which we also optioned. Floyd Hall, who flew off of Iwo Jima and then was shot down off of Chichijima the same day as George Bush, and was on the island and was eaten, by the Japanese high command, the officers on Chichijima in that horrible war crime scenario. And so I interviewed 2 Japanese veterans who were on Chichijima who knew Floyd Hall. And that to me is the one story that I wish we could have told in the war, because it was like why we fight on steroids. It's like this is why we had to win that war. And so, I had the Battle of Midway. One of the first episodes I wrote the first 2 episodes. The first one was Pearl Harbor, where everybody was when Pearl Harbor happened. And then following Robert Elder as he got ready to fly off into the Battle of Midway. And the second episode was the Battle of Midway. And, I remember turning it in, and Spielberg called me and goes, "This is unbelievable. I love but it's a $50 million. We can't afford this. It's so expensive. I mean, it's just like, holy shit. Ironically, 25 years later, it's probably doable. But and then the other thing that we recognized, we wrote all 13 episodes, is it was, and your questions pointed to this, it was too sprawling. It was too big. It was too disconnected. And also the pilots didn't feel like the same show. And so we made the decision, and it was really Hanks's decision. It's like, look, we can't do these guys because it's we should just focus on the Marines. So great. So we went away to the drawing board, cut the aviators out, boiled it down to 10 episodes, and rewrote the series from these 3 points of view. And one of the questions you asked is, what do we get away with in terms of the historical record versus making things up? It's, could it have happened? And the answer, that's why there was a scene between Haldane and Bastogne on Guadalcanal. Could it have happened? Yes. Is it likely? It might even be likely. Do we know? We'll never know. They would never have put it together because Haldane is dead, and so is Bastogne. We'll never know. But having Sid Phillips know, and he remembered Lucky. So the eight ball in the company that was always getting in trouble. And yeah, I remember that guy. He was a pain in the ass. Everybody said the same thing about him. What a pain in the ass. So, that's how I structured it. And I came back when I figured all this out. I had a meeting on the set of Terminal. I called Gary Gesper, said, I'm ready to pitch the series to them. And what I pitched to them is, look, I don't know the ins and outs of it yet, but here are my 5 lead characters and how they all connect and how we're going to tell the story from Pearl Harbor to the end of the war. So I went in, they stopped filming during the lunch break. I went into the fake Starbucks on the set of Terminal with Spielberg and Hanks. I pitched them the 5 characters, and Spielberg said, go write this up, write a Bible. And then so, another 6 months go by. I turned in, it was so big. I said, I'm going to turn in an outline of my Bible. I can't, it was a 30-page outline. And they took that outline and they went to HBO and they greenlit the scripts off that outline. They said, we don't need the Bible, just go. And so we went and we hired the writers and we began writing the episodes, and we were off to the races. Now, when we were off to the races, it had 5 characters, 2 aviators, Battle Midway, Chichijima, and 18 months later, we turned the scripts in, and then we crunched the scripts down and made it 10 episodes. So that's the story of how the Pacific got going.
We just recorded an episode about, the 2 Midway movies, the one that came out in 1976 and the one that came out in 2019, and it's funny because we did talk about how in the '76 one, there's quite a lot of stock footage that they just used from other movies because it's so expensive to film planes crashing into the ocean and whatever, and then in the new one, it's, like, very CGI.
No, I know. Well, it is my big. I mean, I wrote a Midway movie for Warner Brothers that they didn't like. And the reason why they didn't like it is the Warner's paradigm is more solo hero stories, and Midway is really an ensemble piece. You can't do it without really focusing on sort of the group of men. And one of the great pleasures of doing the Pacific is I got to interview a bunch of guys who flew at Midway. And it's incredible what they went through. And Bob Elder in particular fell in love with and married a secretary for Morrison Knudsen on Pearl Harbor. And so I had a character in the Pacific who watched Pearl Harbor happen from her lanai, her porch. She watched it. She woke up with the Japanese planes flying 20 feet over her house. She ran out on their porch. She watched it all happen. And then, like 4 days later, met who became her husband. And he flew in right after the battle and then flew off, went off on I guess it was the Lexington at first, but then he flew off a lot of these carriers. But to have a guy describe to you what it's like to dive bomb a Japanese carrier in Midway, he was the last plane to land on the Enterprise. He ran out of fuel as he landed, and it's just incredible what these guys went through, and talking to him about it. It was a great honor to interview these guys. Special place in my heart, even though we couldn't put them in the show. And I regret not being able to.
Can I ask a question about the Midway movie you didn't make, or that didn't get made? Is that
Yeah,
the one that's on your IMDb that I can kind of see on the? Oh,
yeah.
because we were recording about Midway, and I was like, that's interesting. I wonder what a movie written by Bruce would look like.
It would have looked a lot different than the one that got made, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
It would have been a lot better, I'm sure.
Not most, but a lot of commercial efforts at war are pornographic because they're titillating. And the reason why they're pornographic is because war itself is pornographic. It's compelling visually in a way that stimulates parts of the brain that are really damaging. It is an enormous spectacle, and so you can get really, really trapped in that as a filmmaker of looking at the spectacle and forgetting that this really happened and forgetting the moral costs of it all. And so, it is the greatest show on earth, war, and young men are attracted to it. And so, that's one of the things that's one of the pitfalls that I've always tried to avoid and doing movies about war is you have to dance a very delicate dance between showing it as it is because it is pornographic and not falling into that trap and then forgetting that and one of the greatest movies ever made that explores this is Apocalypse Now, which is the incredible visual stimulation of war done in a way that is very self-reflective and brilliantly done. So both Midway and Pearl Harbor to me are not very successful movies because they portray war as pretty. It's not pretty. It's compelling, but violence is never pretty. So, I would have done something different.
Yeah, fair enough. We love Bob Leckie. We're big Leckie heads. And I think one of the things that is so telling is that, Bob Leckie saw South Pacific and then he walked out and he said, people can't think that that's what the Pacific was like. I'm going to write a memoir. And just to write a memoir, at least partially based on spite, is so funny to me. And it's so like perfectly Bob Leckie from, everything that I know about him. And so a huge part of the Pacific is structured around these letters that he writes or doesn't write home to this girl that he knows from before the war, and it's just brilliant. It's such an amazing way of giving us some insight into Leckie's mindset. And I'm just curious, where did the idea come from? Can you tell us a little more about that?
So funny because I was thinking about that when you sent your question. He did write letters home. I don't know if it was to her or to somebody else. So I know he wrote letters home, and it might have been to Vera. I know he knew Vera before he left, but they were not an item. She lived next door across the street from him. And I remember talking to her about it, and she's like, "Oh, that guy was, he's a little older than she was. That guy was he's a pain in the ass, and I didn't like him very much." And so, but I think he wrote letters to so I should ask Joan, his daughter, because I honestly don't remember where the idea came from, but it's based partly on truth. And so he said, "Well, he's a writer. Let's do it." And I think it's true that he wrote letters, but I'm not sure that he never mailed them. We may have decided that in production to get over the fact that he never really sent letters to Vera. I'd have to ask Joan because I don't remember. I should, but I don't. And I forget the name of the woman that he really had the relationship with. And so we combined a couple of things that were true to make, and the rule for that is when you're writing is if it services the truth of your theme and it doesn't grossly violate the truth of what actually happened, you're allowed to do it. As Picasso said, artists lie to tell the truth. Artists lie to tell the truth. And so that was a lie in some measure, or, a half lie to get to something that was pretty profound of Lecky's response to the war. And it's kind of brilliant. The writer who can't send it, doesn't, he writes that it's not for anybody to read. And it's sort of the birth of him and his moral conscience. So I'm glad we did it. I should look into I don't remember exactly how we put those two things together, but anyway, not a very satisfying answer, but
It's so effective, honestly. And I think as the series goes on, you sort of know that he's not sending those letters to Vera. But then at the end, when she's like, I never got any letters from you. And he's like, well, yeah, I never sent them. And then she asks him what he wrote. And he says, "Oh, it was the best stuff I ever wrote." That's so like quietly, I don't know, emotionally evocative, I guess. Like, I just love that.
no, it's good. And Badge, he did a great job. The cast, it was great. He was a great character. And James Badge stayed very close to the family. He still occasionally has coffee with Joan Leckie, the daughter, and he, would go to shows in New York with the family. He was very close to the Leckie family. So
Yeah,
nice.
he's a perfect Lecky, honestly. I listened to the audiobook and I'm like, perfect casting.
Yeah, good.
In terms of, I guess, these different storylines, we have our Lecky and our Basilone and our Sledge. I think some first-time viewers of the Pacific sometimes find it a little disjointed, and, on repeat watches and stuff, I love to see all the ways everything fits together. But yeah, how did you decide kind of what stories to pull together and how to fit them together and all that kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, the fact that they all had a connection to Guadalcanal in one way or another. Sledge wasn't there, but his best friend was there. And they weren't just friends, they were best friends, Sid and Eugene. I mean, I've got pictures of them at the age of 16 in their coonskin caps out with their flintlocks pretending to be fighting, the Northern War of Northern Aggression. So they were very close. And Sid described to me the day that the war began, and he joined up in the Marines, and Eugene wanted to join, but he had the heart murmur. And I got insights into Eugene's family and his parents and his older brother from talking to Sid. And so I knew once they had all that connection to Guadalcanal, then I knew I could get Guadalcanal, and then I could get New Britain, I could get Melbourne, I could get Iwo Jima because Barcelona was both on Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. I could get Peleliu, which is a stand-in for, a lot of terrible battles, and I could drive to Okinawa. So I could get all the major battles. No, we don't have Tinian, we don't have Saipan, we don't have a lot of other stuff. We don't have the Philippines at all. But I could tell the story of the progression of the war focused on three guys that I could put in one place, at least spiritually, together. So that's how I structured the show, is to service that. And of course, the crux of it is episode 5, because they meet on Pavuvu. They intersect there, not Barcelona, but Lecky and Sledge. And, did that happen? I don't know. Probably not, but it's possible. And that's the rule. Is it possible? And they were within a few hundred yards of each other on Peleliu the first days. Um, that's the way I did it. And I understand the criticism of it. I think it's valid. I think it was a little ambitious sometimes. I think the show really picks up really after episode 3 in a lot of ways. It's hard, you know, but ultimately it works, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Lecky Sledge scene where, he says, "I believe in ammunition." That's just it's such a even though, we don't know that it happened or whatever, it's such a great insight into, like, this guy who just got there and doesn't know what he's getting into, and then this guy who's, like, been through the meat grinder already, like, it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it was good. It was a good scene.
We're always interested in how the Japanese as an adversary were viewed at the time versus the Germans and sort of, I guess, the racial overtones that existed in the Pacific that didn't necessarily exist in Europe. And in the Pacific, the show, several characters question the motives of the Japanese soldiers. And crucially, a character that we've seen represented as the epitome of the American war hero, John Basilone, expresses a respect for the Japanese as adversaries. And I'm curious if this was a topic of discussion around the writers' table and if there was intentionality in including those kinds of moments.
Totally, yeah. It's difficult to write about the Pacific because it was a racial war, and it was a racial war on both sides. And those guys, and in order to kill another human being, you have to dehumanize them. And then and it became really necessary in the Pacific. So the Japanese dehumanized everybody, by 1931. And the process by which they did it was actually in the show when we had the aviators, because we had Japanese characters who, were struggling with their own morality, that was accurate, which was, we and then we tried to bring that into the show as much as we could. That the Japanese soldier in episode 2 at the Battle of Alligator Creek, screaming in moral agony, and then Lucky killing him, and so when he kills him, it's an act of mercy, in some strange ways. And then the racial animosity that we see over and over again, and the cost of what that happens. It's like Snafu bayoneting the Japanese, or machine gunning the Japanese guy on Peleliu, and the visceral hatred that he shows there, and how he deals with it, and then Sledge getting more and more inured to it until to the point where he just doesn't care anymore. And so we felt it was important to have somebody recognize there is some humanity in these people. I think we probably put that in John Basilo's mouth because it was surprising, and it is an ironic show, but he was not Basilone was not the Rambo of the Pacific that he's oftentimes portrayed as, and the whole thing with his playing golf, that's all true. He was a caddy at a country club in New Jersey, loved golf. He was not really a boxer. That was what the Marine Corps wanted to make him. He was a sensitive kid from Jersey, who he was a quirky dude. He would take showers and he would never dry himself after his showers. I was very fortunate to interview his best friend in the Marine Corps, and a guy that was on Guadalcanal with him and stayed close to him and wrote letters with him. Had a lot of pictures of him that I have that nobody else in the world has. And Basilone was not this gung ho guy that everyone thinks he was. So it made sense to have him say that. A little story about Basilone that I'll tell you. This guy told me, he said, "Look, when we were in Melbourne, it was much rowdier and raunchier than people realize. Barcelona and I, my God, we had a lot of fun." He said, we went down to some town, I don't remember what it was, and I just remember waking up in bed with an Australian nurse, the two of us. They'd had a threesome with an Australian nurse. And he says, "If you put that in the show, I will fly to Los Angeles and break your fucking jaw." This is a 90-year-old man telling me this. So we didn't put it in the show. And with Barcelona in particular, the one argument I got in with Hugh Ambrose and the one argument I got in with the producers of the Pacific, we killed him in a way that I don't agree with. Here's what the myth of John Basilone says, and that is originally he was killed by a Japanese artillery shell, is what we were told by a guy that witnessed his death, Chuck Tatum, who I interviewed at length. And then Hugh Ambrose scrounges up his military records, and we discover that that's not true. He was stitched up with a heavy machine gun from his all the way down his torso. And so I looked at that, and we have that in the show. He gets stitched up by a machine gun, but the heavy machine gun part tells me I think John Basilone was killed by friendly fire. I think he was killed by an American machine gun. And I think the guilt in the Marine Corps, particularly Chuck Tatum, knowing this in his heart, is one of the reasons that they have, valorized him. I can't prove it. Hugh Ambrose says, you can't put that in the show. So we didn't, and he was also shot in the face, which we didn't depict in the show because we wanted to show the hero unmarred. And I wanted to shoot him in the face, because it was accurate. And it was also much more morally accurate and much more horrifying. So that's one of the things where we might have blinked a little bit. I can't prove it. To show friendly fire friendly fire kills 20% of combatants, and especially in that war. So anyway, that's a little side story of the Pacific.
No, that's fascinating. I'd never heard that before. And I mean, I think you're right. He is very much, when people think of him, they have like a certain perception, and I think that that kind of death is not what people would, accept about that kind of person.
And by the way, he should have been given a second Medal of Honor. What he did on Iwo Jima is even more spectacular than what he did on Guadalcanal in a lot of ways. He is the real deal. He is Achilles. I wanted to have a character whose death and whose service was unironic in the show. Also, that was true blue Greek hero, and that's what he was. He came back. He fought. He could have stayed in. He found the woman of his dreams. Wanted to marry her. Did marry her, and I think it's important for the show to have that character, sort of the unconscious, man who do or die. Not, oh, let me write letters that I never send, and I'm really angst-ridden about it. We have somebody who just did it and died, and there were thousands of guys like that in the war. But I think we did his character justice in ways that a standard Hollywood, films didn't do. I mean, there's other things about Barcelona that we also didn't put in the show. Most people don't realize that the order to inter the Japanese in 1942 was not only the Japanese. They were gonna go after Italian and German Americans as well. And I believe quite strongly that John Basilone was given his Medal of Honor very, very quickly to highlight the bravery and this commitment of the Italian American community in the United States. They needed an Italian American hero, and that's why he became so famous. There are other guys on Guadalcanal who won their Medals of Honor on that day who did just as spectacular things, but they were wasps, And so they put him forward, and I think he knew that, and it kind of fucked with his head a little bit. So I think we portrayed his sort of like, why me, brilliantly, because it was a pretty deep question and, unsort of untold story of why John Basilone is they wanted to integrate the Italian American population very quickly into the war effort, and it did. It helped.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, we love Lena. This is a Lena Riggy Basilone fan podcast. I would say the most emotionally devastating scene in like all of HBO war, quote unquote, is the scene where Lena goes to meet John's parents and gives his poor sweet little old dad his Medal of Honor. And that house is just stifling with grief. The hole that he left is just so obvious and so sad.
No, I did a lot of research on Lena too, and she never remarried. Yeah, in the original incarnation of the Pacific, the last image of the show was her standing on the shores of San Diego looking at the Pacific. But I think We done good with that scene with her family. It was really powerful, and, it's sad. Think about that poor woman, and she's a stand for, millions of young women and mothers and family members who lost their loved ones in that war.
Are there any World War II, quote unquote, Hollywood tropes that you would say you deliberately avoid or avoided?
Here's my contractor. "Come on in, Adam, you're on TV." "Hi, how are you?" We're renovating our house, so I'll be up in a little bit. We have time, don't worry about it. So, are there any tropes that we avoided?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, I don't even know where to start. Let's look at this from the other end of the telescope. What did we do? What was the mandate? Was to tell the truth and to be as truthful as possible, particularly in the Pacific. As Spielberg said to me when he hired me, he said, "I want one thing from you." I said, "I don't want to blink." We blinked a lot in band. Don't blink. If you find out that a guy used a Japanese soldier's intestines as a water bag, I want it in the show. Okay, and then we did. The pulling of the teeth, the Okinawa was, it was hard to write. It was a really brutal episode to write into film, and, we tried to capture the horror of it whatever way we could, and we got close, but, I mean, all that stuff really happened, and so the tropes that we avoided, there's no easy answers. Nonetheless, we still look blank. Another one of my regrets, in the Okinawa episode, we have them eating at the end, and I forget, the lieutenant comes up and says, "There's some new kind of bomb that vaporized this, city," and that it was sort of a throwaway. Originally, what I wrote was, "Oh, there's some new kind of bomb that vaporized a city," and then it wasn't Sledge, it might have been, forget who it was, but Bergen or somebody turns to the guy and says, "Well, I hope we drop 20 more." And that's how they felt. They didn't care. And Hanks didn't like that because he didn't want to make a point about the bomb, whether we were pro or against the bomb. Well, all those guys in Okinawa were pro bomb by far. And Lecky, after the fact, was anti bomb, but he's writing in 1947 after the full import of it is known. The guys on Okinawa, everybody that I interviewed that was in the Pacific, every single Marine Corps veteran, including one of the Japanese guys I interviewed, said, "Thank God for the bomb." So, and whether or not I agree with that, I don't know. It's an unanswerable question, but I know how I would have felt if I had been a combat Marine in Okinawa and heard about the bomb, and I don't have to go in there and do what I just had to do for 60 days. So it's a much more difficult moral question when you get inside the war and you look at it in a non-historicist way, when you're trying to recreate it. You realize it's a little more complex than looking at it in hindsight. One of the tropes that's true in the war, and one of the things that World War II did, is it helped more than any other event in American history to heal the wound of the Civil War, because these guys had to fight together. In the Marine Corps, especially, there's a myth that the Marines were made up of mostly of Southerners. That's not true. And Haldane and these other guys from hard scrabble New England Marines were just as tough and just as mean and just as patriotic as the Sledges and Sid Phillips of the world. And they were all thrown together and they fought together. And so that's a trope that's true. We didn't really highlight it, but it's, you know, I think we call somebody Johnny Reb, like he calls him Johnny Reb, but it's, by the end of the war, it's like they're brothers, that's it. And so, but yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some other things that we avoided, or things that they're not tropes, they're just things I wish we could have done a better job of. The first person that Eugene Sledge saw on Peleliu was a black Marine dead in the surf. It's in the show. But I mean, we see him in the background. But what happened in real life is one of his cohorts, to remain nameless, looked over and used the N word. Says, "Why is there a dead, guy over there?" Sledge was like, didn't answer. But that's something that I would like to have had in the show. To show there were black Marines on Iwo Jima. And just to show that they were there. And it's important. So, but when you do that, then it begs the question of what's the show about, and it's so that's we blinked, you make choices about thematically what you're trying to focus on. And I wish the show could have been 15 hours so we could have done more, but you can't do that. So
Well, I mean, we would have watched 15 hours for sure.
what else you got?
I am curious, even though I love the Pacific. I see you're also working on some new stuff that I can see on IMDb. Is there anything you can tell us about any of that?
Well, some of the stuff on IMDb is not real. I don't correct it. I don't care. I don't ever add to my Wikipedia page is created by somebody else. I don't, whatever's on there is on there. It's not accurate either. But what I am working on now, like as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to create an ongoing TV show about a submarine in World War II based out of Australia. Really, I hope it happens. It's really exciting. It's a really interesting world, a very high stakes world, and a very different world than what you would experience in ground combat or aerial combat. I did work on Code Girls for a while. It seems to be probably dead. It was a very fascinating show to work on, of sort of the home front of the war and what happened in Washington D.C. during the war. We'll see what happens with it. It was really a social history of World War II because the war did more than anything to break social mores and conservatism in America than anything else. The gay rights movement in America was born in Washington, D.C. in 1945, 44, and 45. Women's rights, the women's movement in America is born in Washington, D.C. and across the country, of women for the first time being given positions of responsibility that were profound, and particularly in code breaking. And then if McCarthyism starts, not in the 50s, it starts in Washington in 1946. The first thing they do is they purge the bureaucracy of gay people in the United States. And that's how it began. And then we're living through that right now. The first thing that conservative movements do is target those who are weak, target those who are different. So I wanted the show to go really badly because I felt it spoke to a lot of contemporary themes in a really interesting way. But Apple wasn't interested in doing it. So it's unfortunate. I'm working on a bunch of things that are non-war related and non-World War II that are non-historical. Can't really talk about them, but they're fun, interesting. I don't always do World War II. So one project that is my dream that might have some life still, we'll see, is I created a limited series about the Black soldiers who fought under Washington in the Revolution. And that's something that not a lot of people know. And I urge everyone to watch Ken Burns's documentary about the Revolutionary War right now, because he touches on it. Not just, hostlers and wagon masters, but a lot of combat soldiers were African American on both sides of the war. And so it's an untold truth of the American Revolution that, a quarter of Washington's Continental Army by the Battle of Yorktown were Black. A quarter. So something to think about in American history. But that's, we'll see if that gets made. Hopefully.
We'll cross our fingers then.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think then it kind of comes to the time where we ask you if you have any World War II books to recommend to our listeners. I'm sure you've read a lot.
I have. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Well, it's just running the gamut. Read a book called Blitzed, which is about drug use in the German army in World War II. It's a fascinating book. And it touches on drug use in the American army as well. The entire both all over the Pacific and the American and European campaigns, there was a lot of amphetamine use. And it's something that's never really been recognized. It's really important. Um, the US Army used bricks of cocaine that they made themselves to pay the Highlander indigenous people to fight the Japanese in Burma. And so if you're wondering where the drug use in Vietnam came from, well, maybe the US Army might have had something to do with it in World War II. That's fun to learn about. The Blitzkrieg by the German army, how were they able to do that? Well, all those guys were stoned. They're all on speed, so including Hitler. Fascinating book, Blitzed. It's a great book. An aspect of World War II that's like out of left field that, wow, never thought of that. Another book that I recommend for people that was very influential in the way I wrote about it in the Pacific is a book called Tenazan, which is about the Battle of Okinawa. Tenazan is a Japanese term for sort of apocalyptic battle. It's like a battle of all battles. And it was I'm blanking on the author, but it was his very well researched book written in the 90s about why it was dropping of the bomb happened, and it's because of Okinawa and how bad that battle was. So that's a book I would recommend. Code Girls, read Code Girls, the book that my show is based on. Fantastic book, social history of women in war. There's so many. I mean, I just, go on and on and on. Another great book that I tried to make into a show was We Die Alone, which is a famous book about it's a Norwegian commando who fought against the Germans. Great book, We Die Alone. What else? I don't know. I could go on for.
Three
Oh, me too.
hours.
People are like, What are your favorite World War II books?" I'm like, Do you have a pen and paper? You gonna write this down? I could go all day."
And the one that hasn't been written yet. That's my favorite. There's so many stories. I mean, it's just like it's crazy that war is so and how these stories all connect. I mean, it's on my IMDb. The one thing I did, I rewrote a script for a Filipino producer about what happened with the Christians who were interred by the Japanese. I forget the island and how they got rescued. They got rescued by a submarine. So I wrote that script, and then I realized that my submarines, those people were rescued by a submarine out of Perth, Australia. So I hope to get to write about it from the other end of the telescope, and it's fascinating story. There was a woman who had a baby, a 3-day-old baby on a US submarine for 40 days. What's that like? It's endless. It's just endless what you can do.
Yeah.
Looking at the Eastern Front. I mean, the Eastern Front is I got asked, "Would you wanna do a series about the Eastern Front?" I said, "No, 'cause it's so dark and so horrible." There is nothing redeeming about it at all on either side. It's like a scorpion's pit of despair for millions of people who are squeezed between two fascist ideologies that are just, it's just awful. And I don't know, maybe a show about the night witches, the Russian female pilots of the war. That would be a great show.
Oh, I'd watch the hell out of that.
Especially because they flew out of a secret American airbase that had American pilots at it, which nobody remembers. So, I mean, it's just endless. And I tried to do a movie that was a joint Chinese American production about what happened in China with basically with Merrill's Marauders and the battle to go into China. And it's fascinating, what happens there and working with the Chinese and that didn't get made, and that won't get made because the relations between the 2 countries are so bad. But Stilwell and what happened with General Stilwell and the Chinese and Mao, and it turns out a good college classmate, a friend of mine, his father was in the OSS in China, and that's an interesting of what happened there. And it's a whole another book that everybody should read. Strongly recommend a book that just came out. It's the first of a trilogy by a historian named Frank called Tower of Skulls. Came out about 3 years ago, and it's about the Chinese and Japanese war. And it is so much worse. Anybody that tries to oh, the Americans manipulated the Japanese into the war and our imperialist designs made the Japanese. It's like bullshit. Go read Tower of Skulls. It is horrifying what the Japanese did in China. Horrifying. If you want to understand why the Chinese right now want to take back Taiwan and have a hard line towards the United States and Japan, read Tower of Skulls, where 5 million Chinese citizens were slaughtered. It's just unbelievable. And, it's different than what the communists say happened. It's very different. They didn't do very much in the war. It was really the nationalists who fought the Japanese. But that's, that whole world is just, we don't really look at it. It's just so, we just turn our eyes from it, because it's too horrible. So those are areas that people could look into.
Those are
Anyway.
great. I feel like so many of those I've never heard of before. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's any aspect of the war you think where's the last samurai charge of the war? Or one of the most important. It happened in Alaska. No people don't realize that. There was a charge of samurai of guys with bayonets who got mowed down by American servicemen on Attu or somewhere. They're like anywhere you go, there's stories of the war that you just have it's just mind-boggling. My milkman in New Jersey was a German paratrooper, as I mentioned. He survived the Battle of Leningrad because he was befriended by a Russian man, a Russian butcher who gave him scraps of meat to survive. What happened at Leningrad is unbelievable. You could do a 10-part limit, it's just incredible. Anywhere you go, it's just crazy. That's what I like about the war is that you can tell whatever story you want to tell, you'll find it happened in the war. Whatever contemporary theme you want to explore in modern American or European culture, you'll find it in the Second World War.
Yeah, for sure. We always find that the more I learn about World War II, the more the subsequent 80 years make sense, you know?
Yeah, no kidding. And I mean, I have particular interest in how It corrupted the American soul, that's for sure, and we're living with it now. Make America great again. What does that mean? It means let's go back to might is right. And that's what the lesson they learned. And it's toxic. Got us into Vietnam, and
Right.
you won't get that answer from a lot of writers who write about World War II, but
No,
Well,
but
thank you.
we've talked about this before on the podcast about how so much of American foreign policy came from this, like, well, we were the ones who defeated the fascists. Therefore, like, we do this. And it's kind of ended up being like a justification for so many things that happened.
no, it skewed our moral thinking badly. It made us think that we were exceptional, which we're not. Nobody's exceptional. We're just human beings.
You've given us a lot of your time and a lot of really interesting stories. Thanks for that. Is there anything you want to plug on this tiny stage that you have on this podcast?
I would plug people to dig a little deeper into, particularly the American military industrial complex and how it grew out of the war. And here's my plug. Can we please do a limited series about a hero who doesn't carry a gun? Can we please do a limited series about the American Press Corps in Vietnam? Can we please do a limited series about nurses in World War II? Please, can we not define our national identity through violence? That's my plug. How's that? Surprised you with that one.
I love that. And because we've talked about you guys, the US, the stories you guys tell yourselves is like fascinating because you guys have such a huge media industry. In Canada, like we don't really make war movies, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is like we just don't have the industry. So just getting to see American war media and kind of like the story that the US tells themselves about themselves, it's like it's fascinating.
It's profoundly discomforting to me personally because I'm part of it. I've been part of it. And I don't like the fact that I've been part of it. I mean, people use these shows, whether it's Masters of the Air, not so much the Pacific, which I am proud of, but Masters of the Air, Saving Private Ryan, they're great pieces of art, of entertainment, but they're used by people to buy virtue, to buy patriotism. Oh, I love Band of Brothers. Well, really, why? And so my plug is let's get a little more sophisticated as audience members and as filmmakers and tell some stories that make us question this because it's not healthy to have a warrior society in the long run. It's not healthy. Canada is a much healthier society than the United States, and you got your own issues and problems. All societies do, and the Netherlands is the same. And nobody's perfect, but American culture is really psychotic right now. And it would be a good idea for us to explore some things that are perhaps not so flag wavingly positive. Anyway, I'll probably get in trouble for saying all this, but
No, 100%.
old man, now I can say whatever the fuck I want. So anyway, thank you. You guys are great. I mean, it's really fun to talk to people who you got my work, and it's nice. So that's why I'm a writer, is for people to think about these things, and it's important to me that it's a good ego boost. But really, the ego boost is, oh, good, people get it, they understand, and keep writing. So I'm glad that you guys got what we were intending, and it's not just me; it's everybody in the production and all the writers. And I do want to speak forcefully of even on the Pacific, where I did a lot of the writing, there was a team of writers, all of whom were heartfelt and brilliant and smart and ethical. We really, all of them on both shows are tremendous human beings. And I can't speak highly enough of not just them, but everybody who produced these shows together with me, who hired me, Hank Spielberg. They're all, kudos to both production teams for doing it. It's really special. Good group of people.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bruce. This has been so interesting. I've been looking forward to this. I love the Pacific so much.
Yeah, it's a big part of my life.
Can you please come on our podcast next week?
If my submarine show goes.
Yeah, sure.
No,
Thank
it's
you so
good.
much.
Thank you, and I really think what you're doing is great, so keep it up.
Thank you
Oh,
so
thank you so
much.
much.
Okay,
Yeah.
guys.
All
All
right.
right.
Thank
Have a
you,
Bye.
nice
bye.
day.
Thank you so much for listening. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast. You can rate us 5 stars. You can definitely send an episode to a friend. This would be a great one to send. You can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com, or you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. Thanks for listening.
See you next week.